Hi, and welcome to our session about having difficult conversations with employees. I'm Christy Hernandez. I work in human resources, and I'm the division leader of learning and organizational development. A key part of my job, and probably the most favorite part of my job, is providing leadership and professional development resources to City of Lincoln employees. So I'm really excited to be sharing this material with you today, and I hope you find that it helps you feel more confident the next time you need to have a difficult conversation. I'm here today with Katie Bear. Katie, will you introduce yourself, please?
Of course. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie, and I'm a member of our HR employee engagement team. A big part of my role is helping city leaders at all levels to navigate HR issues that may come up. So I'm super excited to talk today about one of the many tools we have for you to do that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you'll need two things before you move forward with this session. First of all, take a minute to think about a difficult conversation that you have been needing to have. You'll use that scenario to practice the tools that we share with you today. And then the second thing is that you'll need the workbook that corresponds to this course. So if you don't already have that, you can find it on the intranet using the instructions shown here. Just open a browser and type in intranet.lincoln.ne.gov. And then from that main page, hover over City Agencies and then select Human Resources for City of Lincoln employees. Once you get there, click Learning, and then in the Leadership Development Resources tab that you can see in this image, you'll see a Difficult Conversations workbook. So you can print that workbook, or it is a fillable PDF, so if you'd rather just save that to your computer and fill it in as we go, you're welcome to do that as well. So go ahead and just pause this recording for a minute if you need to get that workbook handy, and then push play when you're ready to continue. All right, even though you're completing this course on your own, it's still going to be a very interactive session about difficult conversations. We're going to ask you questions along the way to get you thinking, and I'd really encourage you to take a minute and think about how you would respond to each one of these questions that we ask before you move forward. I want to get you involved right away, and so we're going to do a quick check. Here's what I'd like you to think about. How do you feel when you need to have a difficult conversation with a team member? Are you super confident and just you're ready to handle tough talks anytime, just bring it on? Are you sort of like, well, I don't love it, but I can deal with it when I need to? Or are you a person that just gets a stomachache even thinking about it, and you just kind of dread having to have those conversations? So just think for a minute, which one do you relate to the most? Which of these options? Most of us don't feel completely comfortable handling difficult conversations. And in reality, there are a lot of conversations that we need to be having as leaders that we're avoiding. What's interesting is that a lot of the issues that supervisors talk to us about are actually difficult conversations that need to happen, but they're disguised as other issues. You know, we're focused on the issue itself and not really the action that we maybe need to take. So maybe it's a performance issue or a conflict between a couple of team members, but ultimately the action that we need to take is to address it. We need to have a difficult conversation with whoever it is that's involved. But those conversations are uncomfortable. So our goal for this session is to provide you with tools and a process that will help you feel better prepared when tough conversations need to happen. Okay, let's take a look at our agenda for today. The first thing that we'll talk about are the 5 W's of difficult conversations. There's a lot involved when we have difficult conversations with people. Then we're going to look at our own default approach to conflict. We'll look at a difficult conversation model that can just help us get ready for those conversations. Then you'll have a little bit of time to prepare for your own conversation. And then we'll round it all out with best practices and common pitfalls. All right, now check this out. There are a lot of books about having tough conversations. So this is really a sign for us, right? If there's so many books, it's probably because we have a hard time with these. So in just a minute, we're going to look at a definition from Crucial Conversations, but then the model that we go over today comes from this book, Fierce Conversations. All of these would be great books to take a look at when you have a chance, but I really do recommend Fierce Conversations. Okay, let's get started with the 5 W's of difficult conversations. And to kind of roll into this, let's take a look at what we mean when we talk about difficult conversations. So basically, it's when we're dealing with a sensitive issue that just feels hard to address. It's one where being honest with someone about whatever the topic is just feels uncomfortable for either one of you, for the person that you're talking to or for you. Now, I do want to clarify that giving everyday feedback is not the same as having a difficult conversation, even though you might feel a little uncomfortable when you have to give developmental feedback. But giving feedback is something that leaders should do as part of our daily performance management activities. And typically we shouldn't need to have difficult conversations on a daily basis. But here's something to think about, to consider about feedback that can make it feel less uncomfortable. I like to look at giving feedback as providing helpful information about a person's performance that can lead them to greater success. So you should give positive feedback when you see someone doing something well so that they know to keep doing it. And you should give developmental feedback if someone has missed the mark so they know and they're able to course correct. When we give feedback regularly, it just becomes part of our team culture. And we want our team members to be successful. We have their best interests at heart. And so why wouldn't we share information that could help them be more successful? But here's something to think about always. Feedback should go both ways. So as leaders, yes, we definitely need to give feedback. That's part of what we're here to do. But we also have to be open to receiving feedback. It's something that we should ask for, but also we need to make sure that we're always receiving it gracefully. Sometimes it comes to us when we're not expecting it, when we haven't asked it, and sometimes it's not in a pretty package. And so we need to always be prepared for that feedback and receive it gracefully as well. That's part of creating a culture where giving feedback and receiving feedback becomes more comfortable. Okay, so enough about feedback. Let's kind of get back to our topic of difficult conversations. Here's the definition of a crucial conversation, which I also think is helpful. A crucial conversation is a discussion between 2 or more people where opinions vary, stakes are high, and emotions are strong. So if there aren't opposing opinions, there's really not an argument or a discussion to be had. And if something important isn't at stake, then we won't really feel cautious about how we approach the conversation. And without strong emotions, then neither person would be very invested or attached to their point of view. So without these 3 elements, it's really just a casual conversation, not just a crucial or a difficult one. Okay, we just learned a couple definitions of difficult conversations, and now I'd like you to take a moment to think about your take on this. What are some of the things we may need to address with people that feel kind of hard? So pause the recording, jot down some of your ideas, and then press play to continue. So Katie, this is kind of an interesting question, right? What are some of the reasons why you might need to have a difficult conversation with someone? What have you seen? You probably see a lot of this.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely performance issues. That, is as a leader, those are absolutely the things that need to be addressed. And those conversations can be really tricky.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also just conflicts between team members. Things come up, right? People don't agree. And so those can be tricky conversations to navigate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have a few examples on the lower half of page 2 in your workbook, and included among those are dealing with conflicts with team members, those performance issues, because sometimes that can feel tricky because it might feel like we've already tried to address it or we've tried to give clarity, and yet we're still seeing those performance issues. So it can feel a little tough to handle those. Inappropriate behavior too. Addressing hygiene issues can feel pretty tricky. And then sometimes we even have issues with peers or our superiors, and that those are legit situations that also we need to have difficult conversations about. We usually think about having those conversations with the people who report to us, but if there's something happening, in our work group with a peer or with our supervisor, we may need to open up a conversation about that too. And the model that we look at today can actually work in those situations too. All right, now keeping those ideas in mind, let's think about why these conversations make us feel uncomfortable. Why is it so hard for us to talk about these things? What's your take? Pause the recording for a moment, jot down your ideas, and then press play when you're ready to continue. All right, so there are a number of reasons we might feel uncomfortable handling tough conversations. Maybe we're worried about hurting someone's feelings or losing their trust, or we don't want them to dislike us, or maybe we just really hate conflict, right? There's a lot of reasons to feel uncomfortable. So do we really need to address things, the kinds of things that we talked about earlier, or couldn't we just ignore it and kind of hope it goes away? What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, it's a lot easier to just sweep these problems under the rug than address them, right? At least it can feel that way in the moment. But I bet we've all seen or been a part of situations at work that haven't been addressed. So let's take an example of tardiness. If an employee is tardy once, that might be okay. If they're tardy every day of the week and you choose not to address it, you're going to start to see impacts on the rest of the team. You'll see decrease in morale, gossip about the employee, maybe even gossip about you and the fact that you're not doing anything to address the issue, and so on and so on. So let's see what we stand to gain by having a difficult conversation. Increased productivity and employee satisfaction, better team cohesion, which leads to new ideas and creative solutions to challenges. And of course, there's a lot that can go wrong if we avoid the issue. Increased absenteeism, personal issues such as stress, anxiety for everyone involved, and it can lead to strained relationships, communication barriers. So that's a pretty good case in favor of having that difficult conversation. So let's talk about who needs to be involved in the conversation. Things to consider here are who the conflict or issue pertains to and the severity of the issue. If the situation is severe enough, or if you have an employee who refuses to engage productively, it might be necessary to have a third party sit in on the conversation. If you think that's the case, you can always contact HR for guidance. So the last two W's are when and where the conversation should take place. What do you think? Let's do a quick check. Which mode of communication is appropriate for handling difficult conversations? Instant messenger, like Teams or text, email, phone call, or the last option, in person, face to face, or via video chat if needed for remote workers. What do you think, Chrissy?
Well, I would say definitely number 4. It's important to always try and have those difficult conversations face to face. But, of course, if we are dealing with a remote work type situation, then yeah, video chat can be a great option for that as well.
Absolutely. Right. Instant messenger, email, phone calls should really never be used as the mode of communication for difficult conversations. It's just too easy to misunderstand someone or misjudge a situation, especially through instant messenger or email. Handling these types of conversations face to face will eliminate a lot of opportunity for miscommunication. And as a general rule, it's a best practice to give the employee time to consider the situation beforehand. We wouldn't want anyone to be blindsided by a difficult conversation. So if there's an issue, make it known and ask them to meet with you at a specific time so you both have time to think about it. Now, there could be situations where that's not possible, and that's okay. Just do your best. And if there are ever extenuating circumstances that feel more complex, don't hesitate to ask your leader or HR for guidance. All right, that covers the 5 W's of difficult conversations. So earlier we mentioned that one of the reasons people might shy away from having difficult conversations is because they want to avoid conflict. That's really normal. But as leaders, it's something we need to work hard to improve. So let's just take a few moments to think about our approach to conflict and what that might mean for us when it comes to having difficult conversations. If you turn to page 3 of your workbook, you'll see a simple 5-question assessment. Go ahead and pause the recording and take a minute to answer these questions and press play when you're ready to continue. Great. Now take another short pause while you total the number of A responses you chose and write that number under the conflict seeker box at the bottom of the page, and then total the number of B responses and write that number under the conflict avoider box. Whichever box has the highest number is your default approach to conflict. Remember, neither approach is better or worse than the other. There are pros and cons for both. Christy, do you think that you are a conflict seeker or a conflict avoider?
I think this is interesting. The survey is, it's a nice little short survey that's good for us to be able to use here. But when I look at those questions, in a lot of those questions, I kind of lean toward conflict seeker. Although honestly, I know that is not typically my style. Like I naturally try to avoid conflict, but I guess there are some situations where I have just tried to build my skill maybe in being able to deal with conflict. And so when I read those questions and respond to them, I kind of go toward conflict seeker. That's just not naturally who I am.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I would think of myself differently at work than I would outside of work too. So I think it depends on the situation, right?
Yeah.
All right, now let's learn a little bit more about the 2 approaches. We're going to watch a short video about your default approach to conflict. While you watch, I'd like you to make a note of one thing about your approach that might make you feel more effective and one thing that might make you feel less effective. You can do that on page 4 of your workbook. All right, here we go.
When it comes to conflict, there are generally 2 types of people, those who avoid it and those who seek it. Avoiders tend to shy away or even hide from disagreements. They care most about harmony with their coworkers. Therefore, they often try to placate people or change the topic because they don't want to hurt others' feelings or disrupt team dynamics. Seekers, on the other hand, seem eager to engage in conflict when it arises, or even find ways to create it. They tend to care most about directness and honesty, and often don't mind ruffling feathers. They will strongly advocate for their own perspective, and often lose patience when people aren't being direct. Neither style is better or worse, and your style depends on a lot of things: your past experiences with conflict, the culture you're from or work in, the organizational context, and even gender norms. If you're not sure which style you gravitate toward, ask trusted colleagues, a caring mentor, or even your spouse. You might ask, do you see me as someone who backs away from disagreements? Or do you think of me as someone who enjoys digging into an argument? You can also take an assessment like the Myers-Briggs or the Thomas Kilmann instrument. Although each of us generally has a preferred approach, it's rare for a person to avoid or seek out conflict all the time. For example, you might be a seeker with your peers, but an avoider with your boss. You likely adjust your style based on the context. Knowing which style you gravitate toward will help you make a conscious choice about how to address a disagreement. If you're an avoider, for example, there are instances when you may need to overcome your resistance to addressing a conflict. On the other hand, knowing you're a seeker may cause you to pause before you jump into a heated discussion. Reflecting on your approach is only half the battle. You also need to get a sense of the other person. Are they an avoider or a seeker? Knowing your style and theirs will help you decide how to best approach the conflict.
All right, this is good information to know about ourselves, right? Because if we're conflict avoiders, we'll probably need to push ourselves a lot harder to address difficult conversations, simply because we tend to avoid conflict rather than move into it. But if you're a person who tends to hit conflict head on as soon as it pops up, you have to be careful not to dominate the conversation before the other person even has a chance to know what's going on. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Christy to take a look at our difficult conversation model.
Thanks, Katie. All right, I'd like you to take a moment and imagine yourself being on the receiving end of a difficult conversation. So you've been called into your supervisor's office because they need to talk to you about something that someone reported to them. Now, here's what I'd like you to think about. What wouldn't sit well with you if you were on the receiving end of a conversation? What would frustrate you or put you on the defensive? What's your take on this? Pause the recording and jot down your thoughts, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Basically, if they were just hitting you with unclear or bad information, that would be frustrating. If you feel attacked, you might get defensive or shut down. Or if you don't get the opportunity to share your side of the story, that would seem unfair, right? Katie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about tone, right? If they come into the discussion, talking down to me, that really sets it off in a bad way for me. If they, come in already upset about something else that has nothing to do with that conversation, that would be my perspective.
Yeah, you know what? I'm glad that you brought up tone because that's so important. I think one of the keys to having productive, difficult conversations is treating it a little bit like a partnership, right? And so if somebody's talking down to me, that's going to immediately put me off and on the defensive. And we don't want our team members to feel attacked or be on the defensive. We want it to be a productive conversation. If you're well prepared, you're more likely to communicate clearly and handle the situation in a way that makes the other person feel respected, which is important because what we really want is to solve this problem and maintain the relationship the best we can. So let's take a look at the steps of the model that we've adapted from the book Fierce Conversations. This starts on page 5 of your workbook. So the first part of the model is to prepare for the conversation. We get our facts right, we check policies and procedures, and we prepare a 60-second opening statement. Then we hold the conversation. So we start out with that opening statement that we prepare. Then there's an interaction between the two of us, and we come to a resolution together. Now, for some personality styles, preparing for a conversation like this is a given. Like I would never be comfortable going into a conversation like this without taking a little bit of time to prepare. But others might be more likely to just jump into a conversation without a plan. I would encourage you not to do that though. But let's take a little bit closer look at each one of these steps so that you feel comfortable with them. So with step 1, we're focusing on getting the facts right. So let's start with this big blue box. In the top section, we're clarifying the issue that we want to resolve, and we're separating facts from assumptions. We're articulating the impact this is having because that's going to help us be clear about why this even matters. Why are we even taking the time to have this conversation? The last part in that top section is owning up to whatever part you might have played in the problem, even if it was just not addressing it soon enough. This is important because taking ownership of your role helps build trust. Okay, so now let's move to the lower part of this big box. This is where we're considering the other person's side. So what might this look like from their perspective? Are they even aware that there's a problem? And what's at stake for them if it doesn't get resolved? That's an important part for us to think about and be able to explain. Moving over to the top box on the right, what do you hope to accomplish by having this conversation? And what are the risks of not saying anything? And then in the last box, think through your emotions about the situation. This might feel a little bit weird and fluffy, but it's an important part of this because maybe you're frustrated because you feel like you're having to babysit somebody who's not getting here on time, or they're not checking their work and making sure that it's that they're handling all the mistakes, or maybe you're embarrassed because you feel like they're undermining your authority in some cases. So there's a lot that could be happening for us, and we kind of need to examine that and understand it. Whatever the emotions might be that are contributing to the response that you're having, you want to just kind of understand that. Okay, Katie, do you want to take the next one?
Absolutely. So step 2 is checking the policies and procedures that should be considered. The importance of this step really kind of depends on the nature of the conversation. If you don't already know this, rules and regulations can get a little complicated in our government work setting. You may have several different resources that you need to consult. For example, there might be federal regulations, labor contracts, HR policies, department policies, SOPs. You get the picture. It really just depends on the situation, but this is really an important part of having your facts straight. If you aren't sure where to look, HR can definitely help with this, or you can lean on your leader's expertise in this area. Okay, in a few minutes, we'll take a closer look at step 3, which is prepare your opening statement. But first, I want to give you a chance to put this into practice and use our planner for the real life situation we asked you to think of earlier. Or if there's nothing currently brewing for you, think of a past situation and use it to try out your planner. Go ahead and pause and give yourself some time to jot down some notes for each of the areas on page 6 of your workbook. Okay, now that we've done this part of preparing for the conversation, we're ready to prepare our opening statement. You'll find this information on the bottom of page 5. The idea here is that you plan a 60-second opening statement. So this might seem a little strange, but it helps you open the conversation in a way that clarifies the issue and the purpose for having this discussion. I think most of us can relate to this. A lot of times when we're in an uncomfortable situation, we try to soften the blow by starting out with small talk. But it's important not to do that because it really confuses the issue, and it can feel really awkward when you need to switch gears to the real topic. Having a clear 60-second opening statement helps you get everything on the table right from the start. I'd recommend that you write your statement down and even practice it out loud a few times before you actually have the conversation. If you turn to page 7 in your workbook, we'll dig into each of these segments in greater detail. So the gray column on the left side of this page expands on each of the 7 segments, and the white column on the right gives us an example. We're going to break this down together, and I'd invite you to underline or put a star or highlight anything that you want to retain for yourself. I also want to point out another example at the bottom of this page. In that scenario, the supervisor is talking to Jackie, who has been getting to work late and calling out at the last minute. This one's just for reference. We're going to be working through the one that's in the chart. Okay, let's break this down. I'll talk about each segment, and Chrissy, if you'd be so kind to read our example.
Okay, will do.
Awesome. So first, start out by naming the behavior that's causing the problem. If there are a lot of issues, ask yourself, what's really at the core of all or most of the issues with this person? It's important to zero in on a theme or your conversation will lack focus. For example,
Jeff, I want to talk with you about the effect your approach during meetings is having on the team, specifically your pattern of interrupting others and dismissing their input.
Next, provide a specific example because that gives your concern credibility. If all you have is a vague statement, there won't be much weight behind it, and it's going to be super easy to just dismiss it. In some cases, you may have a number of examples, but don't give a whole laundry list of all of the problems. Focus on the important things. Here's a good way to do that.
For example, yesterday during our team meeting, you cut off both Liz and Seth mid-sentence and said their ideas weren't realistic before they even had a chance to explain.
Third, share your emotions about this issue. Why is this important? Well, because emotions are personal. Letting someone know the emotion that their behavior brings up for you lets them know that you're affected by whatever is happening. Maybe you're angry, you're worried, you're frustrated. Saying this quietly can be really powerful. Here's an example.
I'm concerned and honestly disheartened because I see the effect this is having. Others are starting to hold back and the group dynamic is shifting.
Next, let them know what's at stake. In other words, why is this important? What do you think is at stake for the person whose behavior you're confronting? What's at stake for you, for the team, maybe even the department or our clients? When you talk about what's at stake, do it calmly and quietly, not in a threatening way. You're simply providing clarification of why this is important. Here's our example.
This is creating a growing rift between you and the team, and what's at stake here is the team's willingness to contribute and have open discussions, and ultimately our ability to do high quality work together.
The fifth part of your opening is identifying your contribution to the problem. Whether it was not clarifying expectations earlier, not addressing the problem when it started happening, or maybe you even played a more active role in the situation. This isn't some sort of confession, but an acknowledgement that you recognize any role you might have played in creating the problem, and you intend to do something about it. Here's an example.
I also see that I've let this go on too long without addressing it with you, and I own that.
The next part is saying that you want to resolve the problem. Using the word resolve communicates a positive intent for a better scenario in the future. Use this opportunity to restate the issue so you can come full circle, beginning and ending with clarity about the topic you're here to discuss. Here's an example.
This is what I want to resolve with you, Jeff, the effect your approach is having on team dynamics.
All right, the last step in your 60-second opening is inviting them to respond. You've just described the reality of the situation from your point of view, and you've reassured them that your intent is to resolve the issue. The conversation is just beginning, and now you want to understand their perspective. This moves the conversation out of your opening statement and into the next step, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's a final example.
I want to understand what's happening from your perspective. Can you share how you see this?
All right, we want to give you a chance to try this out. So go ahead and pause, jot down some notes for your opening statement in the template on page 8 of your workbook. Once you feel like you've gotten a good start on each segment, press play to continue. All right, what did you think? Are you starting to see the value that this preparation can have when having a difficult conversation? Personally, I really advocate for the value of this step and have even practiced with leaders because it can be super helpful to just organize your thoughts ahead of these discussions. All right, now Christy will walk us through the conversation flow. Christy?
Thanks, Katie. Now let's take a look at the conversation flow. This is on page 9 of your workbook. This is a guide for how your overall conversation should be structured. So you'll start with your opening statement. In 60 seconds or less, clarify why you're having the conversation. Next is the interaction. This is where the majority of the conversation happens. So you've shared your perspective in your opening statement, and now you're inviting them to share theirs. Have an open mind here because there might be something that you don't know. So go into it very open-minded. The things that you should do during the interaction are Ask questions to understand their perspective. Pay attention to their body language and tone, and pay attention to yours as well. And then paraphrase what you hear to make sure that you're understanding what it is they're saying. Now, during the interaction, it's possible that the person is going to say something that you either disagree with or it's just flat out wrong. But resist the urge to dispute what they're saying. We will look at a couple of ways that you can handle this in just a minute. Then number 3 on this conversation flow, once you fully understand and acknowledge their point of view, it's time to come to a resolution. So you'll think through what you've learned and work on this together. You may have some part that you have to play in the resolution, but they do too. So ask them what they're willing to do to resolve the problem, and keep this in mind. If what they offer as a solution is not acceptable, let them know that. You have the right to do that. You could agree with whatever they come up with as a first step and then ask, okay, what else will you do? Or you can say, Jeff, that's just not adequate. There needs to be some change on your part. So once you've come to an agreement, decide how you'll hold each other accountable, document the conversation and what actions you've agreed to, and then provide a copy to the employee and save it in the leader coaching file. All right, now let's go back to that part where I said to resist the urge to dispute when you hear something that you disagree with. So if the other person shares something that sounds inaccurate or that you know is inaccurate, don't rush to correct them. Instead, just stay curious, kind of stay, engaged, and ask questions so that you can understand what it is they're thinking. So there's a couple of examples on the slide here. You could say, that's interesting. Can you help me understand what led you to that conclusion? Or can you tell me more about where that information came from? Once you've listened, then you can calmly share your perspective and focus on building shared understanding rather than it feeling like you're trying to win an argument. So a couple of things you could say here are, I appreciate you sharing that. What I've seen is a bit different. Or I can see how it might look that way. Here's what I've observed. So this way you can correct the record without escalating to a debate. Then you can focus on finding a way forward. You could say something like, well, it sounds like we see things differently, but let's look at what we can agree on and how we can move forward. Okay, we're ready for that 5th part of our path. We're going to look at best practices and common pitfalls. And we'll start with a few best practices for your opening statement and throughout the conversation. Now, if you'll join me on page 11 in your workbook, there are some blanks on that page that you can fill in as we go through the items on this slide. So the first best practice is to practice your opening statement until you feel like you can own it. Katie talked about this a minute ago, but it's just really important to run through it a few times so that you just feel comfortable with it, so it sounds natural, and obviously you don't want to read it. So run through it a few times so that you feel like you can own it. The second best practice, the bulk of the conversation should be a dialogue. Your goal here is to understand their perspective. Number 3, it's important to stay objective because that helps to reduce tension, and be sure that you're staying focused on the behavior that is the problem. Now, there are a few ways that you can do that. First of all, choose your words carefully. Make it about the person's action or behavior, not about the person themselves. That's kind of an interesting nuance, but for an example, if an employee is late, center the conversation around the behavior of being late, because that's what the problem is. The person is not the problem, it's the behavior that's a problem. And this is important because it kind of helps it feel like you're less like you're attacking the person. We're just talking about the behavior. Another way to keep the conversation objective is to use I or we statements instead of you statements. So an example of this is saying, you always get to work late and that makes it hard on everyone else. So instead of something like that, try saying, showing up to work late means things start behind schedule, and then I feel a lot of pressure to make sure we get caught back up. So this approach just feels a little bit less threatening, and it can show them how their actions are impacting others. All right, number 6, try to use fewer why questions and more open-ended questions during your conversation. We've all probably had times when somebody has kind of hit us with a why question, like, why are you doing it that way? And that just kind of tends to make people feel a little bit more defensive. Now, there is information in your workbook on how to ask better questions. This is on page 10, and I would encourage you to read through that after this session. We won't dig into it in detail here. And then last, and probably the most important, is to be straightforward and respectful. Don't soften the conversation with false starts like, how are things going? Or try to cushion the conversation by sandwiching the difficult message between two compliments. A lot of times we do those things in an effort to be nice, but it really just confuses the issue. So instead, just know that the way to show kindness in these types of conversations is by being clear, being respectful, listening to their perspective, and focusing on helping them be successful. We want to do those things instead of sugarcoating the message. Okay, so these are our best practices to help reduce tension and focus on the person's growth and development. Now, Katie will bring us home with some common pitfalls. Katie?
Thanks, Christy. Well, we already know that these are difficult conversations, right? And they can become even more difficult when we have an employee that isn't cooperating as well as we'd hoped. So let's discuss some common pitfalls that can occur during these types of conversations and what you can do to overcome them. The first pitfall is when people go silent. Because these conversations are uncomfortable, you might have someone who stays silent throughout the whole meeting, just listening and not contributing. If this happens, try pulling them back to a productive dialogue by priming their point of view. For example, you might make a good faith guess at what they're thinking. If you're right, maybe they'll chime in and say, yeah, that's what I was thinking, and this is why. Or if your guess is wrong, they also have an opportunity to say no and tell you what they were thinking. It's important to try your best to engage them in the conversation. Otherwise, you risk not solving the problem effectively. The next issue you might deal with is the blame game. People who play the blame game are really good at deflecting or derailing conversations in an effort to get out of them. Think back to the example we read earlier about Jeff. In that scenario, after his manager asked Jeff how he saw the situation, guess what Jeff did at first? He deflected. He said, if anyone was upset, it would have been nice if they had come to me. So his supervisor redirected by saying, we're here to talk about the effect your approach is having on the team, Jeff. Tell me how you see it. You might have to do that a number of times just to keep from going down all those rabbit holes. Another way to handle the blame game is to get the conversation back on track with a simple 6-word statement. So the words are listed out of order on page 11 of your workbook. Can you unscramble them? I'll give you a hint. The first word is let's. Think you've got it? That's right. So when someone starts blaming someone else, stop them and redirect them by saying, let's discuss what we can control. This will focus their attention back on their own actions or behaviors and on the part that they play in the situation. The last pitfall we'll address is when employees fail to take ownership. If they are not taking responsibility for their actions, consider these questions. Do they have autonomy? Are they being micromanaged? It can be really hard for people to take responsibility for things when they feel like their actions are being so closely managed that they can't make their own decisions. But if there's no issue with autonomy, they may just be uncommitted to the work they're doing. This doesn't mean they can't become committed. But if they don't, then we have a whole different problem to deal with. All right, we've gone over a lot of information in a short time. Which step do you think challenges you the most? I'd like you to think about each of the steps in the model and give some thought to what you think will challenge you so that you can focus your practice there. The more you practice these steps, the easier it will get. So hopefully you have some practical solutions in your toolbox now for when you need to have a difficult conversation. Feel free to pause to think back through what we've gone over and note your top takeaways on page 12.
All right. So now we'd like you to also take it a step further. We've given you a lot of good information, but really the only way for this to become part of what you do is to practice it. So we'd like you to take a look at the homework assignment that's on the bottom of page 12 or the lower half of page 12, and that'll give you some instructions on how to do this practice. But basically, we want you to find a partner, a peer, or your supervisor, someone that you would feel comfortable role-playing with, and role-play having your difficult conversation. That's going to be the best way to make this feel really comfortable and to get used to using the model. All right, now this is our first on-demand recorded training session, and we'd like to hear what you thought of it. So please use this QR code. Take a couple of minutes and share your feedback on this recorded session. If you have questions about this or other training opportunities, please feel free to contact us at hr@lincoln.ne.gov. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks for learning with us. We hope that this makes your next difficult conversation easier.